Hi there, and welcome to Fuzzy on the Details. My name is Fuzzy, and if you're interested in the Marvel Multiverse role-playing game, you've come to the right place. Today's video is part 4 in our How to Play series, and we'll be focusing on Chapter 10 of the Core Rulebook, the Narrator, but we're going to be focusing on what all players need to know about the Narrator's responsibilities. Future videos will focus more on the nuts and bolts of narrating, like how to run a Session 0 or tips on how to run combat, but this one's written with the new player in mind. This quote from the very beginning of Chapter 10 highlights why such an approach is so important. You don't need to be a narrator to be a good player, but understanding the narrator's role can help you be a better one. I'm going to go a step farther and say that it doesn't only make you a better player, but it's crucial for the long-term success of your game. A skilled narrator cannot create a good game experience alone. So what does the Core Rulebook actually say about being a narrator? Here are the responsibilities that I've distilled from the first few pages of advice in Chapter 10. We're going to be covering each one of them, and then let's talk about what isn't mentioned, because I think that speaks volumes too. A player's responsibility is to roleplay their character well, but the narrator has to keep track of the rest of the world, and that can feel a little daunting, especially for new narrators. How can players be mindful of this? Well, look to how Marvel comics are written or how MCU movies are made. You've only got so many minor characters that ever get speaking roles, and generally the heroes keep their interactions focused on just a few. We don't need in-depth motivations for every Hydra goon that Steve Rogers punches in the face. Players, try to follow your narrator's lead on this. Don't force in-depth interactions with characters that aren't meant to be fleshed out. You probably want your narrators focused on the parts of the story that they think are fun and exciting, rather than have them create a personality on the fly for the guy you buy a bacon, egg, and cheese from every morning. Narrators will probably drop some clues that they want to hit the fast forward button, so be on the lookout for that. Now, if you're a player looking for an in-game opportunity to create a deeper interaction with one of these NPCs, just give your narrator a heads up between games. Say something like, hey, I thought it would be good for my character to have a closer relationship with one of the agents at SHIELD HQ. I wanted to give you a heads up that I may be working on building that up in the next game. Keeping the lines of communication open like this will not only give the narrator more time to create a good personality for that NPC, but also this will provide insight to the story elements that you'd like to see more of in the game. Maybe they'll even create a little subplot based on your input. And yes, it is the narrator's responsibility to play all of the characters in the world, but that doesn't mean they have to create them all in a vacuum. There's no reason you couldn't help out and say, hey, I generated a short bio for a person from my backstory that I thought we could work into an upcoming game. What do you think? When storytelling is a shared exercise, I think everyone gets a lot more out of it. Setting up scenarios and the game itself. When you sit down to game, a narrator has either acquired and read a published adventure or created one on their own. Either way, they've invested time into preparing some scenarios for you to enjoy. In an in-person game, maybe they've even made terrain, purchased some minis, or created some handouts. In an online game, maybe they've created or customized some digital maps, or at the very least spent some time setting up the VTT. An experienced narrator will be able to roll with the punches when characters do something unexpected, but even those who excel at improv probably wouldn't want to waste a lot of time preparing one thing just to have the party do something completely different game after game. So a conscientious player will try to go where the plot's taking them. And this happens in the comics all the time. In the X of Swords comics, there's a prophecy about multiple sword-wielding mutants gathering to fight each other, and Wolverine figures out that he needs to acquire the Muramasa sword, which he does. He doesn't say, hey, I wonder what Mojo's doing right now, and go off in a different direction. Now, if you're a player and the scenario just isn't to your liking for some reason, and that's what's sparking you to diverge off the path, just offer feedback to your narrator after the game, focusing on what you might like to see more of in future games, and they can bring that element to the game. And at the end of any session, players can give narrators an indication of what they might want to do next. And narrators, there's no reason you can't ask. Saying something like, hey, great game, guys, we've got 3 clues for you to pursue. Which one do you think you want to go after first next game? Now the narrator knows where they need to spend the majority of their prep time for next game, and there's no wasted effort. A narrator is responsible for providing descriptions of everything, and they're often multitasking, trying to creatively describe the elements of a room while at the same time they're thinking about those enemies that might be hidden from view, what their tactics might be if and when a fight breaks out, what the rules are for staying hidden, and remembering who on the team might have heightened senses. So sometimes, and understandably, a narrator might not describe things in a way that is clear to everyone at the table. When this happens as a player, simply ask questions or request confirmations. This is especially important if you're playing theater of the mind. Something like, "Hey, you said those Hydra drones were flying towards us. About how high off the ground are they?" If a narrator responds that they're 5 feet off the ground, maybe other players at the table were thinking they were 30. And by requesting this clarification, you've helped all of the players to plan their next actions appropriately. Another thing players can do is remind the narrator you have heightened senses in certain situations, either explicitly or through roleplay. You can say something like, "Wolverine enters the abandoned warehouse, crouches low to the ground and sniffs deeply, seeing if he notices any unusual scents." This way you can kind of stay in character without explicitly saying, "Hey, remember that I have heightened senses." And players, if you happen to have a character that has some sort of sensory issue, it's great to roleplay that proactively as well. So if Daredevil's player says things like, "I take my gloves off and run my fingers over the newsprint, what does the headline say?" versus just saying, "What does the headline say?" They're describing actions in a way that proactively reminds everyone at the table of Daredevil's blindness. And then a narrator is more likely to describe a future scene with this in mind. Maybe something like, "As you're walking by the storefront, there are several pedestrians staring at television screens. Daredevil, you can hear the hum from the TVs, but they're muted so you can't hear what's going on. But everyone's heart rate has accelerated and you hear a couple of gasps. They're clearly anxious about something." Generally speaking, the more that you roleplay your characters with the 5 senses in mind, the more likely a narrator is to insert those details into their descriptions, and vice versa. This benefits everyone at the table with increased immersion. When it comes to the final call over disagreements, the Core Rulebook suggests that a narrator makes the call quickly and moves on in the event of any type of rules conflict. So if one of these conflicts arises and you as a player are 100% totally in the right, by not allowing the narrator to just make a call and move on quickly, you're actually not following the rules either. But there are plenty of things you can still do as a player. Before the game starts, you could ask the narrator if they have any house rules. This can eliminate a lot of conflicts before they start. You can know the rules for all of your powers, and if you're not sure how one might work, you can reach out proactively to the narrator and get some clarity before the game starts. And of course, you can park any mid-game discussions and bring them up after the game in a respectful way. A rules argument can totally kill the vibe of a game, and the folks who aren't involved can mentally check out if it goes on for too long. The narrator's job is to make sure that everyone's having fun, including themselves, but good players can absolutely help out with this. Veteran role players often do more talking than newer ones, so if the spotlight is on you, try to think about how you can involve other characters and shift that spotlight to someone else at the table who hasn't done much during that game, especially newer players. It's really easy to do and can make new players feel welcome. Just turn to them and say something like, "Hey, what do you think we should do, Ms. Marvel?" to get an interaction started. Narrators can check in on players after a game to see if they've had fun, but sometimes newer players might not feel comfortable providing feedback. But a veteran player in the group could reach out and ask them something like, "What did you like best?" or "What could we do more of next game?" Maybe you as the veteran player have a closer relationship with the newbie, and it's just more natural for you to be the one to reach out and get feedback and then provide it to the narrator. And players, you can occasionally ask the narrator if they're having fun too, and of course provide regular feedback to them on the elements of the game that you enjoyed most. Not only does this really fuel the narrator, but it helps make sure that the narrator is going to give you those things that you find the most fun. And narrators, if you're not having fun or you need a break from narrating, just say so. Maybe there's an opportunity for a player to run a few games, either as a side quest that won't mess up your plot or even with completely different characters. Personally, I love to narrate and I do so in the majority of my games, but if I don't have an opportunity to play every once in a while, even if it's just for a game or two, I can get burned out. And finally, finding players. Listen, this does not have to be the default sole responsibility of the narrator. The narrator is already doing a lot to get the game set up. There's no reason a player couldn't help out or even take point on this. Here are some practical things that you can do. If your narrator has made a post on social media, you can boost a signal on that. Maybe your narrator is on Facebook, but not on the Discord or the Reddit, so you can repost the same information there. You can do the write-up for the game and give it a compelling description, or at the very least edit and proofread it. And if your group has a vetting process of some kind, you can help out with that as well. Shared ownership of the process of finding players is never a bad thing. So what are some of the things that a narrator doesn't have to do or need to be? The narrator does not need to be the person with the most narrator experience at the table. This can lead to burnout for the de facto narrator and rob would-be narrators of good opportunities to run a game. At the time of recording this, we're still a few months away from getting the X-Men expansion. That means it's a great time for new narrators to get a start, because we've got more rules coming into the game pretty soon. Also, if you've never run a game before in any other system, don't worry too much about it. My opinion is that this game is ideal for first-time game masters. There's really not that much more that a narrator needs to know that a player doesn't. Heck, you can even narrate this game if you've never played before. That's the position I found myself in, and there's really no better way to learn the rules than by narrating. You get exposed to more of them because you're running the NPCs as well as adjudicating for the PCs. And you definitely don't have to have all of the rules committed to memory. That's no problem at all. There's no reason you couldn't have players help out with that, and also there are resources like Demiplane that make it so easy to quickly double-check rules by just hovering over a word on the character profile. Also, you can always play your first game with a party of rank 1 characters to minimize the number of powers and threats that you need to worry about. If you've got a narrator who was kind and brave enough to volunteer to run a game for the first time, you can help them out in a big way by being a little more didactic in your action descriptions. Rather than just saying, I do a fastball special and stare at the narrator, you can say, I'm going to do a fastball special with Squirrel Girl, who's adjacent to me. That okay with you, Doreen? Good. So first, I pick you up and throw you at the enemy, making an agility check. If that's successful, I don't calculate damage with those dice because Squirrel Girl then needs to make a melee attack. And if that's successful, we use those dice to calculate the damage, and it'll do double damage or triple on a Fantastic. Alright, I'm going to make that first agility check now. Doing it that way not only helps your narrator be reminded of the move that you've probably planned to do for a few minutes now, but also it helps all of the other players at the table know what's going on so maybe they can use that rule in the future. Also, you do not have to be the biggest Marvel nerd at the table to be the narrator. People are playing this game so they can bring their versions of the Marvel characters to life. If they wanted a 100% canon experience, they would just read a comic or watch a movie. Players, I know that it's probably in a lot of our natures to correct someone's understanding of a little bit of Marvel minutia. I am embarrassed to even think about the number of times I've started a sentence with, well, actually, when talking about Marvel. But try not to do that with your narrator, whether they're new or not. Think of every game as a what-if episode, where the fun is figuring out what the differences are, rather than checking to see if the creator got something right. And finally, whether you're playing in person or online, the narrator does not have to be the person to have paid for Roll20 or the Demiplane account, or to provide the space to play or bring the snacks if you're playing in person, or to buy the adventure. Players, if you have the means, don't let somebody's financial situation get in the way of them taking on the responsibility of being a narrator. And final point, remember, this game still isn't a year old yet. Nobody is a veteran narrator. And we've got more and more people getting interested in the game every day, so we need more and more narrators. So if you're thinking about giving it a try, I hope that this video helped you realize that you don't have to go it alone, and that your fellow players can support you. And players, if you are lucky enough to be part of a new narrator's first game, remember that you're helping to shape that experience, and that may determine whether this narrator continues to run games or gives it up in frustration. And remember to give your narrators feedback too. It's kind of like, giving a video you just watched on YouTube a thumbs up. It helps the narrator grow in the right direction and also provides motivation for them to keep running games. That's all I've got for you today, true believers. Thank you so much for watching as always, and like I mentioned earlier, I've got some additional videos planned that will be a little more of a how-to guide for narrators. If you're a player, I hope you watch those too, because I really do think that giving narration a try will benefit you and your entire gaming experience. As always, I deeply appreciate everyone's support. You guys are the absolute best. Thank you so much and have a great day.